Hi there, and welcome to another episode of pianoTV. So today I wanted to continue the two-parter history thing that we've started. So we've done a two-part history video on the Baroque period and on the classical period. So going in order, like sequentially, next up is the Romantic period. And this is a video that's been requested, and the Romantic period in general is super popular with people. And I kind of understand why, because not only did the Romantic era have like lots of really new, interesting music and charismatic composers like Liszt and Chopin, but it's also the era that in a way is the most familiar to our ears, because classical music is really cool, but it's not anything like the music we listen to today. Whereas romantic music is a lot moodier, a lot more emotional, and has more of that like chord melody formula that we expect in modern music. So here's how we're going to do this. In today's video, we are going to talk about the Romantic period in general, what the music sounded like, and then the climate of the world when the Romantic era happened, like the things that were influencing music. We're also going to talk about Beethoven and Schubert because they were kind of cuspers. They were transitional composers from the classical era to the Romantic era, and they kind of like, they were the, I was going to say harbingers. Harbinger, not harbinger. That's a little... They weren't bad guys, they were good guys. So what we're going to do in part 2 of this video is we're going to talk about two main different types of music venues, because you had public music and you had parlor music. We're going to talk a little bit about Chopin, we're going to talk about the construction of the piano and how it was like developed, and we're going to talk about musical rock stars. So stay tuned. So the dates of the Romantic era aren't completely set in stone. There's always like, people always kind of have their own estimates, but in my mind the ballpark was somewhere between 1820 to 1910. So the Romantic era didn't just show up magically overnight on everyone's doorstep. There was a fairly long transition period towards the end of the classical era when, you know, guys like Haydn were finishing up and Beethoven was entering the picture, and that long transition was the signal for a new artistic era. The arts are always deeply interconnected, whether we're talking about music or drama or writing or visual arts or any of the other types of arts. So the Romanticism movement in the arts was directly tied to the Romantic movement in music. So with Romanticism, the focus started to become more personal and more individual. The artists in the Romantic period were longing for something that wasn't quite as like crisp and polished as classical music. Like they wanted to make something that was messier and maybe a little bit more true to human emotions, as opposed to creating something that was really spectacularly refined. So basically what that means is the Romantic period has like a huge diversity in sound because there's a huge diversity of human emotions. So you'll have songs that are silly, you'll have songs that are serious, some that are like really tragic and upsetting, or like songs that sound like they could fit in as a horror movie soundtrack, just a little bit of everything. And I actually think that's probably another big reason why modern humans tend to really like romantic music, because it doesn't necessarily just have like one specific sound. It's a lot more diverse. So in a more theoretical sense, I want to spend a minute talking about how the harmony and the dynamics and other sort of musical elements evolved in the Romantic era. So first of all, the classical era was very tidy. It was based on like logic and reason and all that stuff. And then once we shifted into the Romantic era, it started becoming more about like personal emotion and feelings and stuff like that. So musically, the classical era harmonies, which were very like tidy and clear cut, were replaced with more like dissonance and chromaticism and, you know, more modulation, which is key changing and stuff like that. So the emphasis, part of what made the classical era music so tidy sounding is the emphasis on the 1 and 5 harmony, the tonic and the dominant, and that sometimes started becoming more obscure in the Romantic era, which means that you didn't necessarily have like such a solid footing when you listened to the music. There's also like a heavy emphasis on more minor keys in the Romantic era. You'll definitely notice like a lot more songs are based in minor keys, and because of that they kind of sound like more solemn. Dynamics also started getting a lot more wild in the Romantic period. I don't know if I've ever seen a classical song with like triple forte, which you pronounce fortissimo, and like I've even seen things like this in like for real in music. It's a thing, and it's like honestly like how like fortissimo is like super loud. Like how loud, much more loud can you really get past that that point. But anyway, that's a little side tangent. But definitely there was a lot more drama when it comes to marking dynamics and things like that in Romantic music. Another feature of the Romantic era that started to come into play was a concept called rubato. So that basically just means to play with a flexible tempo. So some of the songs you'd listen to wouldn't necessarily be like the kind of song that you could like tap your toes indefinitely to like one beat, like 120 beats per minute or something. It means that the composer or the performer is going to kind of like go with the flow a little bit more, and sometimes it's going to speed up and sometimes it's going to slow down. So rubato is basically just that kind of flexible tempo. It's a very expressive way to play. Music and art in general isn't created in a vacuum. That's important to remember. It also serves as a reflection of whatever was happening at that time and at that age. So what was happening in the world when the Romantic era emerged? So probably, as you can see here, probably the most important development was the Industrial Revolution. Daily life was hugely affected by the Industrial Revolutions because with the invention of machines and labor-saving devices and stuff like that, life began improving for the common folk, and because of that, the middle class grew. So with a larger middle class, suddenly music wasn't just for like a few wealthy elite people. Music always existed for rich and poor, of course, just like in different forms, but things like symphonies and finer music suddenly wasn't just for like the top tier of wealthy people in the world. It was just, in the classical era, it just like symphonies and stuff like that weren't really available to you, but public performances for just like the general populace started becoming a thing in the Romantic era. But suddenly you had a lot more people with a lot more money, and some of these people with money also ended up having a little bit of extra free time that they could spend learning how to play instruments. Some of these people didn't learn how to play instruments, and instead they went to big public concerts. Now, the modern orchestra and the big public concerts that existed in the Romantic period were brand new. Like, you never really had that kind of big gathering in the classical era. I mean, you had operas and stuff like that, but there used to be a really big class divide in the classical era where only the elite would get to, you know, watch a symphony or do something like that because it would be held at like a prince's estate. But now there were big public concerts that a lot of people could attend. So suddenly, music was for everyone. Aw, gets me so happy. The Industrial Revolution also allowed instruments to become bigger and better and louder. So the piano, which we're going to talk about more in the next video, became definitely like a lot more loud, and it turned into the instrument that we now know and love. Valves were developed for brass instruments. The bassoon started to exist and was incorporated into the orchestra. The orchestra grew, and everyone was happy. So Beethoven was among the last crop generation of classical composers. So when Haydn, who was a classical composer, when he was an old man, Beethoven was a teenager. So he was soaking up all the classical ideals, and his early songs reflect that classical style. But towards the end of his life, and he died in 1827, which is like when the Romantic era was well underway, his music started to take on qualities that we would consider romantic. His innovations in this new musical direction would go on to like directly influence guys like Chopin and other guys like Liszt and Brahms and Wagner and many, many others. I highly love Beethoven's piano sonatas, so I definitely want to show you one of them. Actually, like out of all sonatas by everyone, I would say, like, I don't know, if I had to do top 3, Beethoven sonatas would be, I don't know, in the top 3. I could never pick a top 1. So today's example is one of his midlife sonatas composed around 1805, right when the classical era started transitioning into the Romantic period. This is his Appassionata sonata. As soon as I say it out loud, I'm like, hee hee, it rhymes. This is definitely one of his most well-known sonatas, and also probably one of the most technically difficult. In this piece, you can hear him turning sonata conventions on their head. Like, the intro is really freeform, and as the title suggests, like the Appassionata, it's really, really stormy. This is a little, like, quick little side note. Some of my favorite Beethoven sonata interpretations are by Daniel Barenboim, so if you're Googling, check his out. He's amazing. Anyway, here, I'm going to show you a little clip on what it sounds like so you can get an idea of what it was like and the overall tone and direction of early Romantic music. So we have another guy named Franz Schubert, who was a lot like Beethoven in the sense that he was one of those young uns who composed towards the end of the classical era and at the beginning of the Romantic era. He basically invented a genre, among other things. And these were Lied, or Lieder, when you pluralize it, which is basically blending poetry and music into like kind of a vocal piano work called an art song. His Lieder aren't super famous anymore, except for the one, you'll probably know the one I'm going to show you, just because the genre is more or less obsolete now. But at the time, it was a huge step in a brand new direction. Schubert created these beautiful singable melodies that were simultaneously complex and interesting, but like simple enough that the common listener could actually like appreciate it. It wasn't like too wild and bizarre. And his Lieder are famous for conveying the entire spectrum of human emotion. One famous Lied of Schubert's that I'm sure you've heard before, if you haven't, you're like living under a rock, is called Ave Maria. Now, one of the things that really sets this apart from, you know, compositions by say Bach in the Baroque period or Mozart in the classical period is just the intimate nature of it. Because classical music always kind of sounds like it's reaching for some sort of ideal, but it feels much more intimate and personal. And because of that, it sounds a lot more modern. One of the other reasons this sounds so modern is you have like a single melody line that's sitting over top of like piano, like a simple piano chord base. And this simplicity but delicacy and intimateness, is that a word, is something that Schubert brought to the development of Romantic music with his Lieder. And that is all for part 1 of this Romantic era piano music video. So stay tuned for part 2, where we go into some of the more details, like we really get in the thick of the Romantic era and talk about orchestras and pianos and Chopin and Liszt and stuff like that. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a like if you enjoy the Romantic period or music history, or, you know, the videos in general, and I will catch you next time. They weren't harbingers, though. Chopin and Beethoven were pretty cool.